Here is a green ink by Monteverde Hope.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
Here's a very interesting green. It offers a new hope in finding a green, very much like Luke's lightsaber from Return of the Jedi. Of course, we all know that the saber before that was Anakin's and Darth Vader's first saber. Duh. As I was writing with it, I felt struck with this, I know this color, and it took me a little bit to go, that's it, this is Luke's. And once I saw it, I knew they named this ink casually for Luke. They're such Star Wars nerds. It's a great color with some expected tone variation by nib, but not tons, and it does shade, though again, not tons. It does it very well because they know that adventure, excitement, a Jedi seeks not these things.
The pen for today is a Tasha Spectrum. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib which writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy Safari with a broad nib that writes average. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft fine, we get the lightest tone that we're gonna get. It is still readable on the page, though here I really see it as a secondary tone just because it's not as dark. Now we get no feathering, we get no spread, we get very nice shading. Every word does give us darker, mid, and light tones. I think it does a really nice job. I do wish that some of the darker tones would get a little bit darker than they do, perhaps leaning towards the dark side. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. And at this point, it's not Luke's green as a green, but it is a very nice green. It's here I wouldn't have said, yes, I like this. We get no feather, we get no spread, we do get some shading. It really shows itself better in the third and fourth line once the pen has been writing. I think that first line was where the ink was sitting in the pen for a couple days, so it got to be a little bit darker. Nice green, not the green that I'm looking for from this ink though. Looking at the medium nib, we are spot on with Luke's green. Absolutely no feather, no spread. Yes, it shades very well. Every time it changes in tone, it makes me think of his lightsaber being struck in the epic battle between him and his father. It was a boring battle, but it's not a boring ink. Looking at the broad nib, we get the same tone as the medium. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get the shading showing itself quite a bit nicer than it did in the medium, and I think that's really because we get to see more of this tone on the page from that broader nib. Really makes it much more enjoyable to me, even though it was enjoyable in the medium. It's these two where I really see that color without a doubt. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 11 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get some shading, just as well as it did on the Clairefontaine, showing that this paper has really gone under everybody's radar for a very long time in the fountain pen community. I'm going to be featuring this paper for quite a while, I think. It's really just amazing. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same, or sorry, quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. Same tone that we were getting with the Clairefontaine, which makes me say that it wasn't because the pen sat for the amount of time that it did, just that the wetter pen is giving it much darker tones. A great green, but since I know the tone it can give, it's not the green I want here. No feather, no spread, shades about as well, maybe a little bit better than it did on the Clairefontaine. They starts dark, gets lighter in the Y. Did is a nice light, but not starts lighter and gets darker. So we see shading a bit more frequently. Looking at the medium nib, we get a lighter tone than it was with the wet fine. The same tone as the Clairefontaine. We get no feathering. We get no spread. We get very little shading. It is there. I mean, you can see it some in Thunderstormed and in Thunder Battle. You see it some. It's not really stand out. It's the color that really grabs my attention here. Looking at the broad nib, we get the same tone as the medium, the same tone as Clairefontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get almost no shading. It is there slightly, not like it was on the Clairefontaine, not like it was with the medium, but it certainly does show more in that you see some lighter areas, like on down on the first line where it starts a little darker, really a mid-tone, gets light, and then darker again. And that's the way that it's been shading on this paper with this nib. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, interestingly, we get the same tone as the Clairefontaine, really meaning this is a pretty opaque ink, that it's not being affected by the tone of the paper. The ink is what it is. With no feathering, with no spread, it does shade just as well as it did on the Clairefontaine. It really stands out when you look at Thunderstorm on the first line, Terrible on the second line, The is very dark on the third line. It's really not shading a whole lot there, but Mountains right next to it certainly is. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. Just a tad bit lighter. I think it looks a little bit nicer than it did on the Clairefontaine, though it is that little bit lighter. Has no feather, has no spread, has almost no shading, as the wet fine has really not been giving it up. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine. It is just a tad bit lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. We get no feather, we get no spread, we get no shading. It still comes through and still makes me think Luke's green. And that's a pretty neat thing, that with a different tone paper, it still holds on to that tone. Even though it's just slightly lighter, it's still there. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. No feather, no spread. It is shading just a little bit. I mean, you see it on Imagined and Anything on the second line. You see it on Were and High on the third line. A few spots where it gets a little bit darker, but there is just a little shading happening here. Looking at the back of the page, you see that there's no problem with ghosting and nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairefontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, it does shade. I'm going to say when it shades as well as it did on the Clairefontaine. I think it's doing it a little bit less, where I'm looking at them and there's a few spots that really jump out on the Rhodia, but more jumps out on the Clairefontaine. But it is still shading very nicely here. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, a little bit lighter in general than it was on the Clairefontaine. Now I say in general because it's shading better than it did there. Okay, no feather, no spread. We were not expecting that at all. It is shading, I think, a whole lot better here than it did on the Clairefontaine, where over there it was much darker for a majority of the writing. Here, we get a lot more darks and lights. Beneath on the first line, from on the second, head on the second, blanket on the first. Every word just about has some shading. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. No feathering, no spread. Yes, it shades. I think it's shading a little bit nicer here than it did on the Clairefontaine, just as frequently, but I think it's showing nicer. Where on the Clairefontaine we had more mid and lighter tones. Here we get some of the mid, lighter, and some of the dark tones, like on Stone on the first line, Giants on the first line, Were on the second line. It's really showing us a range in its shading. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as it was on the Clairefontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade just as much and even a little bit better. So the shading is just as frequently as it was. I think the shading is happening a little bit better in how it does it. It gets to a little darker areas. Something I will point out is those vertical lines, sometimes like on trees on the third line or splintered on the fourth, you see it kind of breaks up the ink a little bit, which is a little disappointing in that I thought the ink was a bit more opaque than it showed here. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Birmingham Pen Company, Frick Park, Fern Hollow Creek. Here is Diatramentis Louis Pasteur Sahara Gray. Here is Diamine Umber. Here is Noodler's Bad Green Gator. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone as on the Clairfontaine, a little bit more muted in how it's coming across, a little flatter of the same tone. No feathering, no spread, it still shades just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. You really see the darker spotting through all of the words come up and draw your attention to where that writing is at on the paper, making it a great secondary color from this pen. Looking at the wet fine nib, it's only a tad bit darker than it was with the soft fine, a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. I like the color that I'm seeing here better than I have in general liked the color from the wet fine. I think it's looking much better here as a tone. No feather, no spread. It does shade. It shades. I think it's doing a better job at shading. Like, look at protection and all and they, all of them on the first line. Shading without a problem. And every single line is like that, where it's giving us some nice darker letters to draw our eye in. Looking at the medium nib, it's a tad bit darker than it was with the wet fine, a tad bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread. It is shading, and it's shading about the way that it did on the Clairfontaine, meaning it's giving more mid and lighter tones than it is dark tones. The on the second line is the absolute darkest that it's going to show on this paper with this pen. But in general, I get a lot of here right next to it, where it's darker, gets lighter at the A, and dark at the R again. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering, there is no spread. Technically, I could go spot a few areas here that do have some shading. On the majority, it looks to be a flat tone. Really, throughout all of the writing, it just isn't shading in a way that draws my attention. So I'm going to say it's not shading. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see color comparables, I prefer to see an ink that complements the color on the page. Here is an orange ink by Sailor Kobe number 11. Here is a purple ink by Rohrenklinger Sulfurino. Here is a black ink by Mnemosyne Coalsack Nebula Twinkle. Here is a red ink by Camlin Scarlet Red. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, interestingly, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does feather quite a bit. You really see it in football. You really see it in well and if and you. It feathers fairly consistently, but not the end of the world, not something that would stop most people from using this ink on this paper. It does have a tiny bit of spread, but really the spread is very minimal, and it spreads when it shades. So yes, it does shade, particularly on some of the downstrokes. You see it in football without a doubt. You see it anywhere on the second line. So it is shading. I'm just hoping it doesn't bleed. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. No feather. Why'd I say no feather? It felt like that just happened as a habit because I'm looking at the Clairfontaine. Sorry about that copy paper. I didn't want to take the feathering away from you. You have feathers, lots of feathers. You're like a goose. You spread like Jell-O when it warms. You do shade, though, so you've got that going. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was with the wet fine, tad bit lighter, just a hair lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get feathering that's not horrible and out of control, but it definitely is constantly there. We get spread, which is not horrible and out of control. You just have to be aware to write a little bit larger and faster to handle it. It does not shade, but it gives a very, very nice tone on the page. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, just a hair lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Of course it still feathers, of course it still spreads, but more the question becomes, is it something that you can live with? And I think in this case you can. I wouldn't. Oh, and shading? No, it's not doing it. Looking at the page underneath, you see only a couple spots that touch the page underneath. That was from the medium and the broad. Seeing the back of the page, you see that there's a lot of ghosting, but the soft fine, I guess if you wanted to, you could. I wouldn't write on the back of the page for fear I couldn't really read my notes after how deep the ink gets in there.
So what nib and pen do I recommend using for this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
I love this in a medium flow broad to see the most of the color on the page. It also shades really nicely on better paper, but for non-fountain pen friendly paper, I go for a drier to medium flow medium nib to get the tone similar, as close as I can, to the broad on the premium paper, because right there is the color that I want from this ink.
I hope you got something out of this video, and I want to remind you that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you've heard of something if you were to go to buy.